Thank you and welcome to the KSU virtual Beef Stalker Field Day. Unfortunately, because of the past 6 months or so, we deemed the field day to be conducted this year in a virtual fashion. I've been tasked with addressing some research that we've been conducting at the Beef Stalker unit, looking at limit feeding. And so specifically this morning, I'm going to speak on nutrition and management, what we have found over the last 4 years. I think one basic tenet with respect to starting calves, whether they're preconditioned or even long haul, highly stressed, auction market derived calves, is that we certainly don't want to already compound the many stresses that exist upon their arrival to your facility. And so trying to get calves on feed, full feed, as soon as possible to mount an immune response to the many challenges, to the vaccinations and all the treatment protocols that are imposed upon them is tantamount to their overall success. Some fairly old data conducted by Drs. Hutchison and Cole when they were in Amarillo almost 30 years ago, looking at the differences in dry matter intake between calves that were sick, morbid, versus their healthy counterparts. And it's rather dramatic in terms of trying to achieve a respectable level of energy dry matter for these calves to make that bounce, if you will, from one transition point to the next. And of course, we always look to long stem hay to help them bridge that first location to gain some semblance of a new environment, something that they can hang on to. But unfortunately, at its best, long stem grass hay doesn't bring the necessary protein, certainly not the energy, but we do rely on that nonetheless to get them at that first starting point. And so with respect to getting more energy into these calves, some really good research that's been conducted initially at New Mexico State and much later at Oklahoma State looked at the implications of delivering more energy to newly arrived calves. And what they have found that with increasing amounts of energy delivered to these long-haul stress cattle, there tends to be an increase in morbidity. And be it as it may, the potential reasons for this in terms of increased incidence or severity of subacute and acute ruminal acidosis may be due to the removal of roughage and the addition of starch, be that a fermentable carbohydrate that is not friendly at all to the rumen of these calves as they're being adjusted. But what we have also seen from this same research is that as energy is increased, we tend to see increases in animal performance. Be that as it may, high energy based diets in receiving protocols are still cautioned by nutritionists today. Now, limit feeding in and of itself has been around an awful long time. By definition, limit feeding is a feeding method by which the net energy equations are used to calculate the quantities of feed required to meet the needs for maintenance and at a specific rate of gain. The net energy equations have been around over 50 years, developed initially by Professors Lofgren and Garrett. It is one of the tenets of ruminant nutrition today, and we rely on these equations quite heavily. Back in 1986, Oklahoma State University sponsored a very informative symposium addressing feed intake, and at this, one of the speakers at the symposium was Dr. Bob Lake, who was at Hitch Feeders at that time. Limit feeding really simplifies bunk management, feeding once per day. And for many folks that, especially this time of year during harvest, with so many other things going on in the operation, simplified feeding once a day is really a powerful selling point with respect to newly arrived calves. Limit feeding does require some knowledge of feed milling needs in terms of having a mixer wagon with dependable scales on it, an appreciation for the mix time it takes to thoroughly and not properly overmix a ration. The marketing benefits will speak for themselves, as I'll point out later in this conversation with you today. In this day and age with sustainability, we hear that word an awful lot today. I think there's some incredible environmental benefits that we need to look at again as an industry. And then finally, with antibiotic usage, I think limit feeding in and of itself from a health management perspective lends itself to identifying calves by the means of limit feeding. Now, this slide merely shows one of our earlier trials that basically we had a very good estimate, a good weight of the cattle as they went on feed. And because we are a research facility, we do take weekly pen scale weights, but a producer can take and really have a good idea initially and simply calculate out the needs of that animal and basically stage them throughout the period of time you wish to keep them until you decide it's time for them to leave your facility. This slide here depicts some great work from Iowa State University. Dr. Garland Dahlke developed a really good ration calculator, and he inserted this feature into the feedlot segment of this program to help a producer basically calculate in the incoming weight of these calves, desired performance, and based upon that, basically a calendar, a weekly, or in this case, a daily delivery of the amount of feed for the number of head, in this case, 100 head, to deliver these calves for this basically 1 month time frame. And so it's very simplified. It basically accounts for the increasing weight of the calf, and you merely provide added amounts of feed for the calf as it grows. There are several advantages of limit feeding and some great research that's been conducted in the past. The Ohio State University has done some good work, Oklahoma State. Many of the major beef institutions have conducted a lot of work over the last 30, 40 years looking at limit feeding. And through all that work, what they've determined is that it reduces the cost of gain. It provides a producer to know with respect to the flexibility and commodity trading. As I alluded to earlier, less roughage and manure handling as a consequence, decreased feed wastage, decreased bird predation. We have a lot of starving problems in Kansas, rodent issues, less labor, equipment, and feeding expense, and then finally marketing. Now, what is it about limit feeding in terms of improving efficiency in the animal? One thing we know that as we restrict the animal in terms of the allowance of feed that it receives is that the passage rate of that digestive moves much, much slower through the digestive tract of the animal. And as a consequence of decreased intake, there's a decreased passage rate. And so there's a greater opportunity for greater absorption of those nutrients, which translates into an improved digestibility when all things are said and done. So our higher energy diets are usually already more digestible based on ingredients, be it byproducts and certainly the cereal grains. Roughages in and of themselves are diluents in a diet and are only marginally digestible at best. Typical rule of thumb is 2 pounds of a forage is equal to 1 pound of a cereal grain in terms of the amount of energy that can be derived from it. Limit feeding then and now, back during Dr. Lake's time, they were talking about cattle being started slowly about 14 days post-arrival. And bear in mind that the limit feeding diets being used at that time consisted essentially of about 2/3 rolled corn with only about 13% of a roughage source, be it alfalfa pellets or cottonseed hulls. What we have found at the stocker unit over the last 4 years is that upon arrival, calves are allowed 1% of their body weight of a long stem grass hay, and that is only on their day of arrival. The very next day, we start our limit feeding diet at 1% of their body weight. And afterwards, at each day from there on out, we increase that amount 0.25% to finally 2.2% of the animal's body weight. And it typically is as early as day 5, but it could slip to day 8, if not day 9. Now, the key to making this work to get these cattle on feed at such a quick pace is the high co-product inclusion that we insist upon. And at this point, we're talking that 40% of the dry matter basis in the diet. Now, with respect to limit feeding and bunk management, having adequate bunk space is absolutely necessary. At the onset, empty bunks and hungry, aggressive calves waiting to be fed will be nerve-wracking. That is a guarantee. And we will also tell you that after our experience over the last 3 or 4 years, bunks will be licked slick within 4 to 5 hours post-feeding. And for the remaining 20 hours or so, will be completely clean. The calves will lay around, and they just basically get used to only being fed once per 24-hour time period. So the diets of 20 or so years ago, consisting of 2/3 corn, again, 5% cottonseed hulls, 8% alfalfa pellets, consisting of an energy concentration of 0.58 megacals per pound and a crude protein level of 16%. What we are using quite successfully today is a diet, as I alluded to, containing wet corn gluten feed at 40% of the diet, or even wet distillers. And I'll show a very simple trial that we conducted as well to substantiate this. Corn, about 39% of the diet, and only 13% of the diet consisting of ground alfalfa and prairie hay. And I will tell you that we are now moving to 13% prairie hay and omitting the ground alfalfa completely, so that when it's all said and done, when including the supplement, we're only talking about 4 feed ingredients that are going in to make a diet that's at a 60 NEG and a crude protein level of 17%. Our first study that we conducted to look at this concept consisted of 354 crossbred heifers weighing 490 pounds. These cattle were acquired from auction markets in northern Alabama and Tennessee, and they were assembled by our order buyer at Dixon, Tennessee. We utilized 4 treatments in this first study. First treatment was basically an ad lib, typical receiving diet, formulated for 45 NEG megacals per pound, and it was fed ad lib. This was an ad lib fed treatment. The 3 remaining treatments were fed at 95% of the ad lib, 90% of the ad lib, and finally 85% of the ad lib, with increasing concentrations of energy equal to 0.5, 0.55, and finally 0.6 megacals per pound of TDN. Every morning, the grad student and everybody would remove and weigh all of the hay and feed refusals from the ad lib and basically adjust the intakes of the other 3 remaining treatments accordingly. So we were remaining as true as possible to the 95, 90, and 85% of the ad lib treatment that we imposed. When it was all said and done, this is what the diet looked like. The ad lib cattle were fed at 45%, consisting of alfalfa and prairie hay. Almost half of that receiving diet consisting of roughage. Only 9% dry rolled corn and 40% sweet bran. The 3 remaining limit fed treatments also contained 40% sweet bran, but decreasing amounts of roughage from 1717 in the case of the 50 NEG per pound of dry matter to only 13% taken together the alfalfa and prairie hay, and 39% dry rolled corn. Now, something that we experience in our livestock world throughout many parts of our country is the occurrence of drought in dry conditions. And having to rely on a stable supply of roughage, I think everybody appreciates those challenges. In periods of short supply, prices are driven up. Competing industries such as our dairy industry and so forth. And it really becomes a major hassle, especially when you think about the grinding of the roughage, the loss of the leaf from the alfalfa, everything that goes along with that is a major hindrance. And at best, roughage is pretty much a dilutant, as I indicated earlier. It helps with rumen health and so forth, but at the end of the day, it just translates into more manure that's being produced, and I'll show that information here in a short bit. Speaking specifically for Kansas, drought for us is a fact of life. It occurs in many locations and areas in our state at various times. Sometimes it's very extensive, and sometimes it's very concentrated in terms of where a drought can rear its ugly head. But it is a fact of life, and we need to build and think about feeding strategies that we can minimize the impact from the variability and the weather and the precipitation that we see. Now, with this particular trial, we decreased intake by design. So calves that were ad-lib fed, or to appetite, if you will, achieved about 14.5 pounds of dry matter, as opposed to the 60 NEG cattle that were fed about 12.5 pounds. So that translates into only 2 pounds of dry matter intake between the ad-lib and the 60 NEG fed cattle. But bear in mind the concentration of the energy and the protein that was in the diet. Every mouthful being consumed by the 60 NEG, they were obtaining more energy from less. On an ad-lib basis, those cattle that were ad-lib fed consumed about 2.62% of the ad-lib diet. And again, like I told you earlier, feeding the 60 NEG diet and restricting to 85% of that, we achieved an intake of about 2.25. After this particular trial, we saw only a numerical increase in performance, especially with the 60 versus the 3 other treatments. But taken together, the dry matter intake and the average daily gain generated from this research, we saw a significant response in terms of improved feed efficiency for those cattle fed the 60 NEG diet versus the 50 and even the 0.45 ad-lib fed diet. Other corn byproducts, such as distillers grains, is more prevalent, if you will, throughout the beef belt in many of our states and locations. We conducted a study using calves, steers, derived from superior livestock. These cattle, we got 2 loads from Groesbeck, Texas, and 2 loads of these steers from Hatch, New Mexico. We conducted a 2x2 factorial design study, which basically means we compared calves fed wet distillers versus the sweet bran, and we also leveled in whole shell corn and also the standard dry rolled corn. All 4 diets were formulated to provide 0.6 megacal of energy per pound of dry matter. We had 8 represented pens per treatment, and we collected pen weights weekly, and we adjusted the increasing weights of the calves and thus the dry matter intakes accordingly from week to week. What we found was that there was no impact on corn processing or byproduct fed as well. Said another way, there was no difference in the response from the sweet bran or the wet corn gluten feed or the wet distillers, or feeding calves whole shell corn or dry rolled corn. Looking at efficiency, we saw comparable differences as well. No significant differences for byproduct or corn processing as well. So we concluded that there was similar performances derived from either co-product. We saw no impact on health. We did observe lower overall efficiencies, but we did feed, in the case of this study, at 2% of body weight. And I mentioned earlier, I believe our sweet spot, what we've determined over the last 8 or 9 trials, is about 2.2% body weight, is where the sweet spot for performance is. We also concluded that the extent of corn processing does not impact performance. So producers out there that are taking corn in to be rolled for the use in their calves. Guess what? This trial and previous trials that we've conducted have found that there's really no added benefit for calves, newly weaned calves, all the way up to 800, 850 pounds need to have processed, corn processed in any form and can be fed as whole. So 10 trials and ongoing, what we have determined is that there's no adverse effects on health, and we have observed a 27 to 30% improvement in feed efficiency by limit feeding. We get more out of it. It's more digestible, the feed stuff, that the diet that we're feeding, and we would expect there to be better performance, and that certainly is the case that we have observed. The other side of the coin, once the animal waste goes through the animal, we have issues, and many livestock operations have nutrient management plan issues. It's a huge issue it's a millstone around a lot of operations' necks, especially if a producer no-tills and has to concern themselves with weed load and certainly soil compaction. So trying to produce beef efficiently and at the same time to minimize animal manure issues and in terms of content, the amount is a huge issue. What we have found with limit feeding, we have conducted associated intake and digestibility trials with each of our pen studies that we conduct. And what that basically means is our graduate students do very intensive studies using cannulated beef cattle, basically having a window into the rumen of the animal to collect samples and to basically get a better understanding of what's happening to the digesta as it moves outside through the rumen and ultimately into the manure. In this particular study, I want to draw your attention to the dry matter intake of these steers was 20.2 pounds, and again, the restricted cattle were only getting 14.8 pounds. But bear in mind the 45% roughage, the 22.5 and the 22.5 of the alfalfa and the prairie hay translated into almost 8 pounds of neutral detergent fiber versus 3.81, basically cut in half. Acid detergent fiber intake, 4.11 pounds versus 1.458 pounds. The digestibility, we observed 0.62 versus 0.71. So there's greater utilization of the diet moving through the animal's tract. When it's all said and done, there is a 42% reduction in the amount of fecal dry matter output. We're talking 7.5 pounds of manure dry matter versus 4.34 pounds dry matter, a 42% reduction. That is substantial. Here's some drone pictures that I took from a trial we just finished up this last spring. We had 16 pens total. Can you see the difference between the darker pens that were fed ad lib versus the lighter colored pens that were the high energy 60 NEG limit fed diets? Very apparent. This is one set of treatments here, 2 and 2. Here's a dark one, a light, 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 dark, dark, and you can see it. You get the point. It's substantial, especially during wet, inclement events, cold, wet weather. We got a lot of energy issues in terms of animals moving themselves through in terms of maintenance needs. Manure issue is a huge one. And as an industry, I believe limit feeding is one strategy we can use to make ourselves a more efficient industry. Feeding logistics. We've done a fair bit of work using GoPro cameras mounted to the tractor and to our feed wagon to quantify the animals visiting the bunks in terms of enthusiasm, to try to do it from a health check measure, but also to calculate the amount of time it takes to mix feed containing a lot of roughage versus diets that do not have a lot of roughage, that being the limit fed. And so with increasing amounts of energy in the diet, the number of loads to deliver possibly can be reduced. You might be able to even shave one load off per daily feeding and thereby save yourself added labor, tractor hours, and etc. There's also a reduction in feeding waste. more of it's going into the animal. And we've seen the animals with high roughage fed diets putting their head in the bunks and raking their heads outside of the bunks and throwing the feed outside, creating a great opportunity for rodents and also for the starling bird predation. I think there's great opportunities with limit feeding to have those bunks cleaned within 5 or 6 hours of being fed in terms of having pests, if you will, that are around your feeding facilities. What happens at the feed yard? I've received a lot of questions from producers asking, well, what are the implications of limit feeding during the backgrounding phase? And when these cattle are eventually moved into the feed yard, are we tightening their guts up so much that they aren't able to express maximum dry matter intake? There's a lot of questions regarding the period of time it may take to get these calves on feed. If they're already on a 60 NEG diet, can we perhaps shave a week off of getting those cattle stepped up quicker and getting them through the system much, much faster? Before I proceed, this is some of our intensive work with with the intake digestibility study, the cannulated cattle. And what we did find, in fact, that with the 60 NEG diet, the pH, excuse me, of the 60 NEG diets, there was a linear trend downward. In other words, it got much, much more acidic. And in terms of the time below 5.5, you could see the 60 NEG diet, 764 versus 542 minutes. So, you know, are we potentially impacting the rumen papillae? Are we creating potential liver abscesses down the road where we may not be expressing full performance and holding these calves back? Those are legitimate questions that we had, and we answered that question earlier this year with some calves that we followed through the feedlot into the packing plant. This next slide shows this dark yellow line represents the 60 NEG fed cattle over a 24-hour period. Once they were fed, the pH does get down there. It does get down to perhaps right around 5.4, as opposed to the hatch blue line, the ad lib fed cattle, you know, barely got just a tick above 5.8. So there are differences. We are experiencing different reactions, if you will, in the rumen with respect to the energy content of the diet being fed. But I still maintain that feeding the digestible fiber from the co-product is the key, as opposed to using the high starch that we find in many of our cereal grains. What we found from the raw closeout data, this is raw closeout data, and we did separate the heavies and the lows, and so we had 4 pens of cattle that we followed through. With respect to the light-fed groups of cattle, they were fed for a period of 161 days. The ad lib, the limit-fed cattle come in heavier than their respective ad lib-fed cattle, and the same as well with respect to the NEG, 60 NEG versus the 45 NEG fed group that were fed for only 41 days. In terms of closeout for the light-fed cattle, these cattle came off heavier, the 60 NEG cattle. We did see some compensation in terms of increased average daily gain, as well as feed conversion as well. And I think we should expect that coming off of the limit-fed cattle from that backgrounding phase. The same trend held true as well in terms of the increase in average daily gain, as well as the improvement in feed efficiency during that finishing phase. In both instances, for both the light and the heavy group, dry matter intake across the respective feeding period, there was really no difference whatsoever. In the meat, we saw cattle that were only numerically, those limit-fed cattle numerically heavy by about 7 or so pounds compared to the ad lib-fed cattle. Hot carcass weight was only numerically different. However, we did see more fat deposition, more back fat at 0.71 inches versus 0.65. For quality grade, No significant differences between either the 45 or 60 background fed cattle. And with respect to the liver scores, looking at the health of the liver, there was no significant differences between the 45 ad lib versus the 60 limit fed calves. I mentioned earlier the marketing window in terms of how people can leverage this. If you know the rate of gain, if you do know the rate of gain that your calves are growing at, you can project in 3 or 4 or so months into the future, and utilizing a really great tool that was developed by my colleagues over in the Department of Ag Economics. It's called beefbasis.com. It allows you to lock in the weight of the calves, your intended sell date, your buy date, and you can look into the future and look at the actual daily gain and also the projected value of gain of these calves. So you can, if you see an opportunity, you can idle the calves up a bit, or certainly you can idle them back if you want to hit a particular window. I think there's some great opportunities if you're looking to market your cattle as feeders into the future. Something to look at. Now, for us at the stocker unit, I've done the calculations. If we look at the efficiency, and these numbers are all expressed on a per 100 head basis for a 90-day turn. With our ration feed efficiency, we're looking at about $1,460. Our manure production costs us to move this manure off of the location we're at. And by the way, I invite you folks in the future to actually come to our stocker field day. It'll be in September next year, 2021. But it costs us true money to move the manure off of our facility, about $500 for 100 head. We see our savings there. I don't have a number on cattle health detection, but intuitively, if those calves have only been fed once a day, and if they're not at the bunk when the feed wagon rolls up there, there's probably a problem somewhere. And so we tried to quantify it, but we were unable to, but there's something to it there. The market window, there's some value there. And Dr. Tonser will talk more about the efficiency and so forth in the presentation following this one. The finishing phase, the reduced days to full feed. I alluded to that earlier. That's going to take a lot of coordination, if you will, between the nutritionist for the feed yard, knowing the feeding conditions for those calves that were backgrounded and how they're going to be eventually integrated into the management at the feedlot. It's going to take some integration, but I think it's a good point to consider that calves that have been limit fed, especially at the 60 NEG level, are acclimated to a higher energy content. We saw the pH levels in those rumens. I think we could shave some time off getting those cattle up to a full feed ration. When it's all said and done, we figure about a $20 bill savings from limit feeding, not including these other 4 factors that I've placed here. With labor savings, feeding once per day, it could go as high as $2,700 if you're feeding on a twice-a-day basis. And so, as I wrap up this presentation, there's a lot of aspects to limit feeding. I think, first of all, co-products, very critical in this case. We're feeding at 40% of the ration dry matter. So if you're going to deviate from that, please be mindful of this very important consideration. The low roughage inclusion, I think, is a winner in and of itself for growing cattle. The market planning is vastly improved. Knowing how your cattle are growing and being able to predict how they will grow using the NRC equations is very apparent. Reduction in manure output, I think, is from a sustainability perspective, I think it's true. We've shown the continued improved feed efficiency values, and the health detection, I think, is a huge one as well, especially in this day and age with our antimicrobial usage. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the many members of our team that are responsible for generating these results. Certainly the manager and RAs, Bill Hollenbeck, Ross Wall was with us. He left not too long ago. Kyler Sewer, our research associates, A good friend of mine, a close confidant, and an adjunct professor, Dr. Sean Montgomery, is very instrumental with his experiences, actually working with producers out there utilizing this technology, as well as the KSU my KSU colleagues, Doctors Evan Tigemeyer, Tarpoff, AJ Tarpoff, Greg Hanslacek over in the diagnostic lab, and Dr. Nagaraja in the vet school. And the graduate students who put a lot of hard work into generating these results for their theses, Tyler Spohr, Marissa Johnson, Charlie Sasser, and lastly, Morgan Salachi. I appreciate each and everybody's contribution to this work. And with that, I appreciate everybody's attention, wish you well, and look forward to seeing you next year in the flesh at the KSU Beef Stocker Unit. Thank you.